welcome to another episode of Nick's Nerd Network. My friend and nerd John is back with us today, and we are going to be talking about different topics that relate to the trans community. So this is Nick's Nerd Network, and I'm Nick. So I want to first say thank you so much for coming back to join us today, John. If you haven't seen it before, there's an episode earlier where we talk about John's book that he published, UBU. Definitely check it out. There's a link in the description. It's a great book, and it's a great resource to cover some of the topics that we're talking about today and provide more information. So, John, the first question I have for you today is what got you interested in the obstacles that trans people face? Was it someone that you met, or is it something you learned in school, or anything like that?
Well, as a gender studies doctoral student, understanding or learning about transgender experiences and activism and challenges is part of what I do. I don't think you could teach or learn about gender studies without including trans topics, or certainly you shouldn't exclude those topics. So I think it's an important part of our world today, and I'm really glad that as a gender studies instructor, I get to help teach people about this topic.
I appreciate so much that you're doing so, because there's a lot of people who don't know very much on this topic. I can speak to, like, a lot of people think, like, the LGBT community, LGBTQA community, that they all understand, they're all on board with everything that has to do, or everything that falls under the rainbow flag.
Right, like the Matrix, where you just get a download.
Right, you just know it all. And it's not true. I mean, there's a lot of gay people, like anyone, there's a lot of people who don't understand, even if they fall under the LGBTQA, that don't understand these topics and might have some sort of like prejudice or like some not so informed thoughts about this topic. I myself thought when I first came out to a friend of mine, we were discussing like being gay and the hardships we face, and then we somehow transitioned into trans topics, and we were like, oh, well, I don't agree with that. And then we immediately stopped ourselves, like, how can we express how we feel and impose how we feel on somebody else? That doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that we have someone like you as a resource and other resources to provide us with this information. So another question I have for you is, what does it mean to be trans?
Sure, and just to clarify, trans is short for transgender. So usually when we're born, a doctor looks at our body parts and is like, it's a boy or it's a girl. And first I want to mention that not everyone comes out male or female. Some people are intersex, which means that their bodies are neither male nor female. But then separate from your physical body is your gender identity, which is how you see yourself in terms of gender. So a lot of people see themselves as men or women. Some people also see themselves as gender queer or gender fluid or gender nonconforming. And if your gender identity matches the sex that you're assigned at birth, then you are cisgender. So like when I was born, I wasn't there, but people tell me the doctor said it's a boy, and I identify as a boy, so I am a cisgender boy. But also, some people's gender identity does not match the sex they're assigned at birth. Mm-hmm. So a famous example is Laverne Cox. When Laverne Cox was born, the doctor said it's a boy, and Laverne Cox grew up and said, no, I'm not. And good for her, she's gone on to a really successful career, especially emphasizing the experiences of transgender women of color. So again, to be trans means that your assigned sex at birth does not match how you see and feel yourself in terms of gender.
So, John, what are some of the big challenges that transgendered people face?
So many. Violence, job discrimination, housing discrimination, and also bathroom discrimination. So in terms of employment, especially for transgender people of color, the unemployment rates are about 4 times higher than for other people. And keep in mind that in the US, most people get their health insurance through their employer. So this raises the risk that people who are trans will not have access to health care. And also, even though people often assume that gay rights is only an issue of marriage or maybe adoption, housing is also a big issue because unfortunately many families still kick out their children when they realize that they are queer or trans. And so homelessness is a big problem for trans people, including here in Columbus. Of homeless people under the age of 25, I believe 1/4 are LGBT. And
wow.
Yeah, and
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a big number, because we're certainly less than that in the population. But to refocus specifically on trans people, Bathrooms are another big issue, not only because it really sucks when you have to go to the bathroom and you can't, but that's actually a broader issue of access to public space. Like, think how hard it is to go to school if you know that from the time you leave your house in the morning to the time you come home at night, you can't pee. And that, like, just the psychological stress, the physical stress, and same thing with workplace, or if you're traveling, if you're going through a train station or airport, it's very stressful and it can be dangerous. And connected to that, trans people definitely are targeted for all different types of violence. And something that came up a couple years ago when Laverne Cox was being interviewed by Katie Couric is the issue of how people like to focus on trans people's genitals and surgeries. And Katie, even though in many other ways is a great journalist, she kept focusing the questions on whether Laverne Cox and the other interviewee had certain surgeries. And Laverne Cox said, hey, when you focus on our junk, you are distracting from the real issues, which are how we are mistreated and the sort of violence that we face. And so I think I encourage all viewers, when you're thinking about trans issues, to not focus your question on, like, what parts do they have and how do they do it? But like, how is this human being treated when they walk down the street and when they go to school, and what can I do to make a safer environment for people in my world who are trans? I would say for most LGBT people, there's this weird contrast where we're either made invisible in pop culture or we're made into a spectacle. So on one hand, for so long, there were almost no positive images of LGBT people in the media. But then sometimes when you do see those images, they're like very hypersexual. So for example, if you Google lesbians, we all know what's going to come up, like pornography, or people's only image of what it means to be gay is someone shirtless in a bikini at gay pride. And I encourage all expressions of pride at gay pride, or most of them. But my point is that it's a bummer when that is the only image available for what it means to be gay or trans, that you're either invisible or you're some sort of like scary pornographic spectacle.
So when people oppose trans rights, what reasons do they give?
The two most common reasons I hear are that people view transgender experience as unnatural, or they view trans people as threatening to others. So in terms of the unnatural argument, in my book I talk about the myths that we all grow up with, the myths that there can only be two genders and you can't switch and there's something wrong with you if you want to. And so when you've grown up with those ideas, it can be really hard to accept that somebody who doesn't fit those rules could still be like a good and decent person. And what I always say to people is, just because it feels natural to you that you identify with the sex you were assigned at birth doesn't mean that has to be true for other people. Like, some people really like jelly, and I have to say it icks me out, but I don't think that makes you unnatural. Pickles, that's another story. But anyway, the other issue is the claim that transgender people are threats. So in the recent conversations around bathroom bills, there's been the claim either that transgender people would, sexually harm children, or that straight men would disguise themselves as trans women in order to get into women's bathrooms and harm women. And it's important to remember that people who want to commit sexual violence are doing it anyway, including frequently forcing their way into women's bathrooms or wherever else. So allowing transgender people to exist and go to the bathroom when they have to pee does not cause more sexual violence. And in fact, it's often trans people who have to fear violence, including sexual violence, from straight people. So more broadly, a really common theme when it comes to majority-minority relationships are that the majorities will imagine that the minority is scary in some way. So like, a lot of white people are raised to feel afraid of Black and Latino people. A lot of straight and cisgender people are raised to feel scared that gay and trans people are going to prey upon them, when actually it's very often the opposite. So if you are like afraid that a trans person is going to come into your bathroom and harm you, maybe instead you should imagine the fear that that trans person has to experience every day when they walk out of their house, just walking down the street. And I want to add, I've sometimes heard people say, essentially, hey, I don't care if trans people live in fear or face violence because they deserve it because they've broken the rules of gender. So there's kind of this attitude as if the rules of gender are valid, and therefore if you choose to break those rules, just like if you choose to steal, then you deserve whatever's coming to you. And I want to push back against that and say, no, like those social expectations, like the belief that you have to be a man or a woman, or that everybody with a penis has to wear blue and play sports, those rules are not true. They change over time anyway. So like, let's make up some rules that make people happier and make space for the actual diversity that exists.
And like, honestly, why can't we all just be people? Because the more and more I see is like this like idea from people who are opposed to people who are transgender or feel threatened by them. It's this idea of it's the same kind of, not the same, but like similar themes of like why people are opposed to gay marriage. They see somebody getting something or like having a right, and they somehow perceive it as it taking away from their own rights. And it's really unfortunate that that's what's making people who are transgender feel unsafe going to the bathroom. That's what's making people who are in same-sex relationships like afraid to like walk in public and hold hands. They're not doing anything to hurt anyone, but by somehow living their true selves, people are interpreting it as dampening or taking away from their life. And it's not that.
Definitely. And adding on to that, one example that comes to mind, many of you may know the kind of internet commentator Ben Shapiro, who's kind of a younger guy who does conservative political commentary and is especially very negative about trans rights. And he had a tweet a little while back, and I'm going to try to quote the tweet. It was something like, I don't care what gender you think you are. If you, with your penis, want to come pee at a urinal next to my daughter, like, you can get the hell out. And one of the replies to the tweet was like, does Ben Shapiro think there are urinals in women's bathrooms? But also, it's just like this idea that trans women are somehow a threat to your daughter. What if your daughter's trans? Like, what if you are actually harming your daughter by like saying such negative things about trans people in front of her? And yeah, I think that's just a really powerful example.
And it's so harmful in such a developmental age for a child to hear those kinds of things from their parents, because either A, they're going to take that information and continue to spread it throughout the world, or B, it's going to harm them in the case of if they are trans, like you said, and not feel like they can talk to their parents about that, or feel like they're hiding, or feel uncomfortable talking about those things.
Absolutely. And so when I hear people say, you can't talk to kids about LGBT topics, you're corrupting them, you're harming them, I'm like, no, it is just the opposite. What is harming kids is when you say stereotypical, very rigid stuff about gender and sexuality and love in front of them. And more broadly, and I think this applies not only to trans topics, but to all LGBT topics, if you're listening to this video, I want you to really remember that you never know who in your life is listening carefully to what you say to decide whether they can trust you. And so when I was 19 and I started coming out of the closet, it really amazed me how clearly I remembered things that people, like adults in my life, had said many years ago. You know, like not even things people said to me, but things that I heard in the next room when I was watching TV during Passover Seder or like some kind of big event.
Yeah.
And, you know, probably when I was 5, I didn't quite understand why I was hearing that or filing it away. But you just never know who around you is like absorbing what you say, and that they later may decide that they can't have anything to do with you and need to cut you out of their lives because they think that you're not going to accept them. So if you think to yourself, well, does it really matter if I say this nasty thing or if I laugh along with this nasty joke about trans people or gay people? Yes, it matters, because you never know who around you is depending on your reaction to learn whether they can have you in their lives.
Well, Jon, thank you again so much for coming on today and coming back with us and sharing more topics like this. It's super important information. I'm so glad that we're able to provide that and put that out there. And like I said, if you haven't already, click on the link in the description. It'll link you to the episode where we talk about Jon's new book. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, I highly recommend it. It's a great read no matter what age you are. And it's a great way to either talk about gender to other people or to learn about gender yourself. So check it out, link in the description. That's all for this week's episode. Jon will be back with us soon. This is Nick signing out. Bye, guys. Hi, if you like this episode of Nixter Network, please like and subscribe, or visit our new channel. And when you're on the new channel, check out my new banner. That was made by my friend Jesse. Please check out his website. He's really talented, and I'll leave the link in the description. He's great for all of your graphic design needs.